If you have followed my previous videos, you know I've had some issues with the pump. It was pulled out and pulled apart. At first it sounded so impossible to get hold of any spare parts for it, so I started doing measurements and seeing what options I had if that wouldn't have been possible. And there will be some redneck solutions here because I'm doing a cheapo repair. I didn't even order the original gasket kit even when I found out it would have been possible to buy some spare parts. Did some measurements with the different O-rings needed. Figured out that these half moon shaped bushings are actually metric in size. Checked all the different size plugs because they have O-rings on them. This one was a metric bushing, and I had already ordered a round one for a lot cheaper than the new half moons would have been, and the plan was to cut it apart and create two half moons. Doing some careful measuring to ensure the thickness is correct, and it's very close to the thousandths of a millimeter in an area that has seen little wear. Measuring the tabs that hold them in the correct position. Had purchased some new O-rings for the plugs, had brought them with me, but the smallest plugs here, the O-ring was a little bit on the big side. I didn't really like it. I ended up pulling them out again. I'm glad I did, because one was damaged on installation. But I found some in a kit we had in the garage, so that I replaced them with. Also adding some tread sealant to all the plugs. Clean them good, compressed air, trying to remove any oil. New O-rings and tread sealant, and just putting them in place. I'm very curious to see if this redneck repair will hold up. I'm actually gonna post this video before the pump goes back in the machine, so I can't well, I will have to update if it worked or not. Check the big O-ring that it looked good. This one I'm most worried about failing, not going with original. If it's an extra hard O-ring or a different spec than what you can buy normally. Some hammering on some of the plugs to ensure they are well on there. Here I brought out the kit and replaced those small plugs. Since we don't have a lathe or a good way to do the cutting, we rigged up a angle grinder and worked slowly around it to not generate too much heat, and they turned out great. They were not 100% equal in size after being cut apart, but it shouldn't matter. Marked up where to drill the holes for the guide pins. Then used a punch to make a mark. Had a round thing and a bit of paper to protect the coating on the inside. A small pilot hole was drilled at first, and then the full size hole. Then I just used a big drill to smooth out the coating that had kind of globbed up there a little just around the hole, removing that. Then it was just a matter of start assembling things. The guide pins were put in place and the half moons were put in there, and they feel solid where they sit. And the bushing was just a fraction of the cost, and technically I've ordered the bigger, the one that was a little wider, so I had 2 chances to try cutting it. So I have enough for next time I need to repair it if this turns out okay. Put that angle plate back in there. When I had it in there and started kind of gently moving it back and forth, I could see it making a few little lines, and it was a little jagged on one edge, so it was actually brought out. I missed the video of that, but soon you can see there is a file laying next to it, so I kind of just took the little imperfection I could feel off. It's at the sharp edge, and it was kind of a little mark there. And then the piston is installed, strong Loctite on that one. Figured out this O-ring I must have had the wrong measurements on or something, so it didn't feel right, so I ended up buying a new one. And here I have to rant a little about this bushing here. Even if it's technically possible to buy it from Parker themselves as a spare part, you have to buy it complete with the entire back half of the housing. They don't sell this bushing separately, and this caused me a little headache, and eventually I figured out that it's an imperial one, it's not metric, and once that was figured out, I found some faint marks on it. This one was kind of damaged, but then it was no problem ordering it. It cost very little, but it was a long lead time to have it ordered, so a little glue on it to ensure it sticks there, some hammering, then pushing the other plate back on there, and feels really solid. Tried test fitted the axle and to feel how snug it is on the axle. It feels good. Had rigged up some pipe and some stuff, so if the bearing would need a little hammering to get down there, but added some heat and the bearing slid almost all the way on there. I tried it first, but the lock ring wouldn't go into its groove, so I ended up putting the old bearing that had been cut to be removed on there, and just a punch. Here I tried kind of gently tapping it down to see if it would drop into its groove, but it just wouldn't. It required a little micrometer further down, so. But 4 taps, one in every 90 degree with a little force, and then back with the lock ring. Still, it was not really want to go in all the way around, so it needed a few taps here and there to snap into the groove. And it was just a matter of sliding the shaft and bearing into the housing. Then it's a big lock ring holding it in place. Then it was about trying to fit that revolver barrel with all the pistons, and there are 2 half moons. You see the brass part on top that is kind of bolted to that angle plate, and I was worried this would be a little tricky. I thought of ways to be able to install this with it standing up, but couldn't figure out a way, so I had it laying down, and the top one I could line up and get the bolts to start, but as I tilted it back up, the other half moon kind of fell on its side, and it caused me a little struggle getting it back up. I had forgot to start the camera as I try, even if I'm not sure if the video would have been possible to see, because it's so deep down there. But eventually I was able to catch it and be able to get it up where it should be, and tighten that one up also. Did a little test moving it back and forth, and it seems to move. the plate, the cover on here with that bigger sized O-ring, and that small one next to it was bolted back on there. And then I used some grease here because this O-ring was a little out of shape, and to hold it in place. And I put the lid back on there, but it felt like it connected with the barrel too quickly. It didn't feel right, so I took a break and went out with a small 2-stroke machine, clearing some young forest and spacing that out. And then I figured out, I wonder if one of those half moons could have shifted, and sure enough, one could be moved. Then it was just a matter of being able to wiggle it out a little and then sliding it back and forth a little, and there all of a sudden it kind of snapped in place. The other one didn't budge when I pushed on the edge that could be seen, but one side did, so that was what's caused it to be a few millimeters off what I would have liked. And with that in place, I tightened things up. There is a big spring involved, so you have to do some tightening as you go down. The return spring was added, and the lid for that, just pushing down and started twisting, and it went right down there. Had some tread sealant on that also. Then it was about tipping it over to install the shaft seal. The seal could just be pushed into the carrier by hand. The carrier itself needed a few taps to go down there. Then it's a big ass lock ring, but I put that in place. It needed a few taps to go all the way down and started to seat in its groove. The regulator was put back on there. Fresh O-rings on that also. Then the O-ring sealing, a new O-ring to seal between the pumps. Torqued here I started adding the straps for lifting it. It's not for holding it down, even if it was a little tricky getting it to stay still enough to torque up the bolts holding the cover for the adjustment piston. But eventually they all clicked. Rigged a little more with the straps to lift it for putting it back in the machine. Brought out the big clamp to hold it down while torquing the big bolts on the back. The torque wrench I had didn't go far enough. It wasn't big enough, so it was the manual tool with a pipe on it to go a little by feel and tightening it up to where I think it should be. So as I said earlier, a bit of a redneck repair. Then I spent some time cleaning up, and hopefully in the next few days it will be assembled back into the machine so I can start finishing up the things I've started looking over with the engine, because I need to be able to crank that in the near future.